It's Wednesday on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined by Brian Batko. We're going to be talking about how the Steelers expect to approach this final preseason game and why the indication is we're going to get to see more of that first-team offense, but who at quarterback will be running that first-team offense? All that here and more on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined by Brian Batko, one of our great Steelers beat writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where you can get all of our written work at post-gazette.com and find us here on your favorite podcasting app and on YouTube every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the North Shore Drive podcast, but also every day with all of our different daily content here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Brian, it's been an interesting week leading up to the Steelers' final preseason game. Mike Tomlin indicated that the Steelers are going to treat the third preseason game this year as if it's a traditional third preseason game back in the days when it was four preseason games. And as we know, back then, that was the game where you saw the most out of the starters in this game. And I think a lot of that comes from especially this offense, because the first team offense has not scored on a single drive yet this preseason. And I think there's a bit of anxiousness buzzing around about what's going on there. But I think the big question is, well, the first team offense, it had in the first game Justin Fields leading it. It had in the second game Russell Wilson leading it. And there's lots of talk nationally who will be the starting quarterback. Brian, do you expect Russell Wilson to get the lion's share of what the at quarterback with the first team on Saturday, or could this be a back and forth mixing to see what both of these guys have?
I think it's probably more likely that Russell Wilson gets the bulk of it, just because, you know, we talked about this in late July when Russell Wilson first had the calf issue crop up. It was kind of like, all right, this is a built-in way to evaluate Justin Fields and take the long look at him that you might not get when the calendar flips to August and certainly September when the regular season begins, if the pole position quarterback remains as your starter for week one. So I think, you know, not that there's any sort of complete assessment done of Fields, but, you know, Russell Wilson only got 5 drives. And again, it was mostly bogged down by pass protection. And, you know, I think a little bit of Mike Tomlin's, I think there was a little bit of excuse making from him as far as you didn't get to see him operate because of the 3 and outs. It's like, well, part of a quarterback's job is to keep you out of 3 and outs. But yes, obviously he was, he was not in an advantageous position there when the pocket's collapsing on him almost immediately. Who could have foreseen that Broderick Jones was going to have his worst game as a pro in front of him? So yeah, extenuating circumstances for sure. But, I think that, like I said, they've seen a lot already of Fields with the first team, with the second team, in practice, in preseason. There's still some unknowns and some uncertainty about Russell Wilson. And I think even Arthur Smith acknowledged that when we heard from him Tuesday, as far as, you know, he used the word limited to describe Russ, not so much physically, but at least, I mean, that's part of it, but also just in terms of the play calls that he was comfortable putting in for him and what he was able to do on the field, knocking off some of that rust while he was getting his first preseason action with the Steelers.
And I think that there's some right to feel a little bit limited. He didn't play much through training camp. Yeah. And I was banging this drum throughout training camp. I was like, when are they going to see Russell Wilson at QB1? Because it wasn't that often until like the last week that we got to see any bit of that. And, you know, now we're sitting here in the last preseason game, and no one's really sure what this really looks like when Russell Wilson's playing with, you know, decent enough protection to see down the field. And Brian, I know,
and that's why it was such a catch-22 when the calf thing first happened, because there was one side of it that was like, hey, it's early, it's July 25th, better that this happened now, and better that he misses these unpadded practices and so on and so forth. But it's, I mean, in the NFL, I mean, we know that coaches value these practices so much, and all the time you have on the field is precious. So I thought from the beginning, hey, it's early until it isn't anymore, because the regular season is coming one way or the other. And every day that you're on the sideline or not participating fully, especially for somebody who, yes, he's established in the league, but not with this team. That's going to cost you. And I still don't think it's going to end up costing him the starting gig week 1, but I just think that there's been 2 trains kind of moving since report day, and he hurt his calf pushing the sled. Russ taking a little bit of a step back, and Justin Fields taking a little bit of a step forward to make this closer than any of us anticipated.
Well, see, that's the thing, is that I think when you say that, Brian, when I say that, Brian, I think that there's people that miss the local conversation, in that Russell Wilson has been QB1. I think there's some people out there that think, oh, it's already over. Justin Fields has won the starting job. And I can't think it'd be farther from the truth. Now, I will say this. Justin Fields has closed the gap on Russell Wilson. I think that certainly happened because Justin Fields has improved throughout training camp and looks a lot more composed in how he's making his decisions. But there's still this expectation that that's what Russell Wilson can do once he's like, with the offense and has that chance to develop that chemistry with his starters, the kind of the way that Justin Fields had for about 3 weeks of training camp.
Well, like any competition, but I think it's especially so for quarterbacks. And, we used to go through this with the Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, Mason Rudolph triumvirate as well. It's never just as simple for an NFL head coach to say, all right, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to look at my binder of all the training camp stats and all the cut-ups that we've got of what these 2 guys have done in practice and preseason.
Right.
And then I'm going to base my decision off that. No, there's always more context to it. Mike Tomlin even says these guys, what they do in practice and preseason games matters. The games are weighted more. He also says that. But they have resumes as well. They have bodies of work throughout their careers, whether that's, in the NFL for more than a decade in Russell Wilson's case, or in college for a first-round picks case like Kenny Pickett a couple years ago. I mean, they're never just basing it on the fairness of how you look in a Steelers jersey in practice. It's never that simple. I mean, it's probably what every competitor would want, just judge me based off what I'm doing when I'm with you in this current situation. But no team operates that way, I don't think. I mean, you treat everybody with a clean slate to some degree, but part of that is all baked into why they were attracted into Russell Wilson in the first place, why any team would bring in a Super Bowl winning veteran who might be in Canton someday, because it's not just as simple as, okay, what is he showing us in this very limited 1-month window? That's a small sample size compared to his first 12 or 13 years in the league. So, I mean, that's all stuff that's kind of working against Justin Fields, and he's kind of done as much as he can to try to get his foot in the door, prop that thing open. And even if it doesn't lead to him starting week 1, it's going to be a long season. There's going to be ups and downs. I think he's at least positioned himself to say, hey, I'm ready if the call comes, not, oh boy, we better keep him far away from the field because he needs a lot more time to grasp this offense and make a difference if something happens to our starter.
And to be clear, the latter there was definitely the concern going into training camp, because he didn't look great in mini camp. And then even the first couple of days of training camp, there were some questions going around. What's going on with Justin Fields there? So I think that's the position the Steelers really are in, is that Russell Wilson, unless everything looks terrible in this preseason game and does not progress at all in the next couple of weeks of practices, then that's when I think the Steelers might be like, okay, what do we actually have in our hands here? But until then, Russell Wilson is QB1, Justin Fields is QB2, and we'll get to see both of these guys probably have some more reps with the first and second teams on Saturday against the Lions. We want to talk more about the offense, and it's really the group that kind of let down the quarterbacks this in the last week, and that was the offensive line. We'll get to that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko, stick with us. We'll be right back. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Brian, the offensive line, I don't think has tried to dodge any responsibility for what has happened, what happened in the last game. 4 sacks total, 3 on Russell Wilson. Broderick Jones was particularly responsible for 2 of them pretty early on. And we got to talk to a lot of this young offensive line. We also got to talk to Troy Fautano. We'll get to him in a bit, where he is in his recovery. But I thought it was a positive for Broderick Jones that he did not dodge the accountability for the problems that he had in this game. Granted, we didn't get to talk to him after the game. We kind of had to wait through the morning. We got to talk to him after the Tuesday practice. But I thought he stood up, he took accountability, and he said what he has to get better at. And he at least gets points for that, because we've certainly been covering this team when certain people won't take responsibility when they don't do their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been one to expect a young player to say all the right things immediately after a game. Mm-hmm. So I kind of understand maybe where Broderick was that night. I mean, the only people he blocked Saturday night at Acrisure Stadium were the reporters afterward. But he's somebody who he's never been one to duck and dodge that kind of stuff. And, he was probably going through it at that time. And yeah, like he said, needed some sort of medical treatment to address that elbow post game. But, he's going to be under the microscope now for sure. I can't imagine those team meetings were fun for him the next day with Mike Tomlin and company watching the film. Mike Tomlin said that he'll judge his response based off how he looks in their next outing. So he's holding the second-year guy to a higher standard, and you just hope this isn't something that lingers. In some ways, it could be good for him as a wake-up call, because he didn't face much adversity in his time in college. Georgia just ran through everybody. Even last year, I mean, the team faced adversity, but Broderick was a lot better at right tackle off the jump than a lot of people, I think, expected. So things went fairly smoothly for him as somebody who was in an unfamiliar position. And maybe it was as simple as, I don't have time to overthink this. I just need to get in there and play naturally, show what I can do. And it worked for him to lock down that spot the second half of the season with Chukso Okorafor on the bench. Now he had a whole offseason where normally you start to see that leap for second-year guys. We did not see that through the first two preseason games. Perhaps this will, reset the expectations for him a little bit. Could really pay off in the long run if it allows him to say, hey, I can't just coast on my physical abilities and traits. I need to make sure the technique is right. Other teams are getting the book on me. Opposing pass rushers are going to know my tendencies, know what works. And, when the real games start, if I don't shore things up, offensive coordinators are going to attack me or defensive coordinators are going to attack me in certain ways, look for these mismatches and try to take advantage of what they think is a weak link. So I can't be that. I liked what I heard from him Tuesday, just talking with us in the media. I have no doubt that he's probably attacking it the same way with his coaches and his teammates.
Certainly. And I think, again, the way that he addressed it, like you were saying, like he talked about, like, I got to ask him specifically, like, hey, your feet looked great. Like you were in position, but what was going on with your hands? He's like, I got to improve my hand-eye coordination because I can't let them, I can't lose those battles. And that's things I need to sharpen up. And I thought, again, that they have the insight on himself, just or the realization is like, hey, this is what I am coming up short in right now, and acknowledging that and saying, hey, that's what we're working on right now. That's not always easy for a second-year player looking who again, like you said, he dominated in college. He was very strong last year. There was a lot of confidence coming in. We've seen plenty of young guys come in and be like, yeah, whatever, I'm fine, and not even want to dive in the mud of what are their mistakes. Again, I think that's a real big positive for the Steelers in what they're trying to get out of a guy like this. And I also I think when you listen to him, we also talked to Zach Frazier, and he talked about things that he's trying to improve upon. Troy Fautano was hurt, so it's a little different, but he also said, like, I asked him, like, how has he taken on the notes that he got from his first game, even though he's been injured since his first game. And he said, I've watched that game 100 times now. It sounds like these young offensive linemen, I guess the big three, if you will, that they're hoping to emerge in the coming years. It sounds like they're all giving mature responses, mature approaches into their game, and not just accepting, oh, well, we're going to get there at some point because that's why we were drafted in the first and second rounds.
Yeah, I mean, the two tackles in the center, if not the three most important positions on any line, at least the ones that are pretty much the most, they have the biggest spotlight on them. I mean, when you're alone on an island trying to block a Greg Rousseau coming off the edge, that can be a relatively lonely place, even for a unit that is codependent on one another, by nature. So yeah, I mean, it's with Fautanu, it's a tough spot for him because he is behind the 8 ball. If he can't play in this game, you don't want to, we heard it again from Arthur Smith yesterday. You don't want to speculate necessarily on what things are going to look like in the regular season if you don't work out the kinks in the preseason. Fautanu hasn't had a chance to do that since his knee injury, so that'd be taking a bit of a leap of faith if the Steelers run him out there week 1 in Atlanta. At least he is an older guy with so much college experience that maybe you'd feel a little bit better if you just see it in practice against the likes of Alex Highsmith or TJ Watt or Nick Herbig or whoever he ends up getting a chance to block in team drills or one-on-ones, but still different than when the bullets are flying in a real game. I talked about that on Tuesday's Chipped Ham and Football with Trey Essex. So yeah, I mean, it's not a great situation right now for the Steelers offensive line. It's a good example of you can lay all the right stones for your foundation in terms of the draft resources and evaluation, development, finding guys with good character, and yet weird things can happen, such as Nate Herbig going down with that shoulder injury that I think we all, at least you and I, expected Zach Frazier would probably climb over him on the depth chart by the regular season. That's why you use a second-round pick on that position. But the depth is hurt now for sure, and Frazier is kind of drinking from the fire hose a little bit more than he would have been. I think he's looked good, but it's still going to be a little bit of a less margin for error circumstance for him. And then Broderick Jones with an elbow injury that happens on the last day before the pads came on in camp, so very early. That's another hurdle that nobody expected, and he's going to just have to play through and work through it. But you hope it doesn't affect him all season, or at least for any part of the regular season. And then Fautanu, obviously the knee injury derails him early in his first preseason game. So you hope that all these guys have the ability to sort of, overcome that, and you'll rely on all their pedigree and everything like that. But this is why I think we were saying, even in the spring, even after the draft, when vibes were good, optimism was high from the fan base, still a lot of new, and there's still just there's always a learning curve for rookies at any position, even the offensive line, even guys who look like can't miss slam dunk players. That doesn't mean they're going to be that from day one.
Absolutely. And to further your point, about Broderick Jones and, him, we asked him about his elbow. He's like, it's not the problem. He's like, the elbow brace isn't the thing. It's not hindering me. I got to be better. He was like, everyone's dealing with injuries. And he did acknowledge that there are quote unquote multiple injuries that he's battling through right now, but he also dismissed him like, that's not what happened Saturday. I even asked him, was there anything different between Thursday and Saturday? Because we saw him go up against Greg Rousseau on Thursday and look pretty good doing so in the joint practice where they did live reps against the Bills. And he was like, nope, I just had one of those days. I gotta be better. And I think that those are more good signs. But I want to talk to you, Brian, about Arthur Smith, because I thought it was also interesting how he addressed how they've been on offense. We'll do that next year on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Savinas, Kane, and Galucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. That's Savinas, Kane, and Galucci. Call them now today for a free consultation. We're also brought to you by Moon Township Honda. Go to Moon Township Honda, located at 5802 University Boulevard in Moon Township, Pennsylvania, or go to their website, moonhonda.com, for all their great deals on Honda. Here's a message from our friends at Moon Township Honda.
To build the Honda CR-V Hybrid, we took everything you love about the CR-V and kicked it up a notch with greater power. For a CR-V unlike any before. Adventure confidently with Honda, Car and Driver's most awarded brand in 10 Best history. The CR-V and CR-V Hybrid, part of the Honda line of rugged vehicles. Visit your local Honda dealer where new vehicles are arriving daily. Buy online or reserve from select Honda dealers.
Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Brian, we got to talk with Arthur Smith for quite a bit yesterday before practice, actually. And he didn't dodge like his players. He didn't dodge responsibility for, or dodge any criticisms of the offense, about that. Yeah, they need to score. They need to finish better. They need to be cleaner about things. But I did think it was interesting, like how he kind of made it clear, like, look, they're not calling plays right now. They're not sequencing plays like they would in a regular season game. And I think everyone kind of knows that, but he did highlight a lot more as we kept talking about it, how like, hey, look, we're experimenting in so much and what we're trying to figure out what players can do. That's been the goal of preseason, is finding these individual evaluations versus trying to just call a game like you'd want to in a real game and beat the other team straight up and get all the points and win all the reps there. What was your interpretation of how Arthur Smith handled the presser? Because we saw a lot of pressers with offensive coordinators in recent years that were kind of dismissive of early season problems that led to regular season problems.
Yeah, I don't think he was dismissive. I think he did try to strike that right balance of, it wasn't good enough. There are certain, football 101 basics and fundamental principles basically that we didn't handle. So I think he addressed that properly. But yeah, he also talked a lot about context in the preseason and how the evaluation of any offense, it needs to consider the willingness to keep things vanilla this time of year because the standings in the preseason do not matter one bit. I never like to say the final score doesn't matter because I think coaches and players are out there trying to win, but clearly the result of the game is going to be long forgotten the next day and once the regular season rolls around. But yeah, I mean, to your point, Chris, you said there's a lot of repeat play calls, more than you would see in a normal game. The schemes, we talked in the first segment about how he was not opening the whole playbook for Russell Wilson as a way to sort of protect him from himself and that calf issue that I guess is not quite 100% yet, even though Russ said after the game he felt strong and he felt great, but clearly not everybody's quite on the same page with that. So,
right.
Or at least there's some gray area in saying you felt good and you felt strong and all that. So yeah, I mean, I get what he's saying. It's not excuse making, but at the same time, nobody's printing out a banner for preseason champs. And I think he's also just making the point that, when we get into a real game, we're going to game plan more for the Bills and Greg Rousseau. And if our right tackle's having a rough night, we can do a little bit more to help him out. Whereas in this case, it might have been, hey, we'll keep isolating him and let's see if he gets up off the mat. So I mean, that's all understandable. This is not Arthur Smith's first rodeo. It was Matt Canada's first rodeo as an NFL offensive coordinator,
right,
and play caller, not to draw too many parallels or comparisons. But yeah, and for Smith too, he's coming in here with a new team, new personnel. He can watch all the film on them that he wants. He can spend all the time around them in practice that he wants, but doing it in a game is a new thing. And they're all still feeling each other out in that regard. So that's the biggest takeaway to me. But, taking into account these last two Steelers preseasons with different quarterbacks, different coaches, I'm not going to put much stock into the overall product offensively because, I mean, it's just, we saw last year how good it looked and then boom, comes out week one and it's completely stifled by the 49ers. I'll still evaluate individual players and maybe what they're doing well or not doing well, but the overall just, the feel for the play calling and, what running this and this on 3rd and 2 or 4th and 2 or in the goal, like that kind of stuff. I'm taking that with a grain of salt, to say the least.
No, I agree too. And, I thought it was, a good example of how Arthur Smith tries to do things. And I asked him this question because I was looking at game film and I was going over the all 22 of how the offensive line was operating. And there were just some running plays where I was like, that's a weird way to try. Like, that's a weird way that Zach Frazier was being asked to block. Like, he was going over like 2 gaps to get a linebacker and it just didn't make sense for him to attack that angle. And then I was like, wait a second. I think this is part of what they're experimenting because traditionally he would just go after this linebacker that was right in front of him, but instead he was trying to reach all the way around and get a guy. And I asked Zach Frazier about this too, and he said, yeah, that's part of what we're working on right now is seeing how quickly I can get to the second level and where I can get, because if he can get to a guy 2 gaps over at the second level, that then opens up. It makes it easier for other guys to just get the guys right in front of him and can, really shift what the Steelers do offensively. But Arthur Smith is testing it. Okay, how good is that? Because Zach Frazier, I think that one thing that he's done very well. One, I don't think he's given up a single pressure yet. As far as playing in preseason. But 2, he is one thing I think he's doing really well is he's getting to that second level. He's getting his hands on his linebackers. He's walling them off in the run game, and that's been a positive. So, if he's doing that now, I think. What Arthur Smith is doing is saying, okay, how far can he go with this? What can I use him to do? How can I use him to cut things off? Because if he's able to do these things, it can open up so many more different ways to attack with my other offensive linemen and with my tight ends, and setting up both Najee Harris and Jalen Warren and Cordell Patterson with better rushing lanes. So if you're looking for an example of what's being experimented, it's things like that help the Steelers get a better sense of how aggressive can we be in certain directions here.
Yeah, and the flip side of sort of the argument that, okay, you can tinker with some different things, try some different things, and it doesn't really matter this time of year would be, hey, it could help with a team's confidence just to see the ball go through the hoop a little bit, or in this case, the ball go into the painted area of the field and either, be caught in there or run into there, which has just been very tough to come by for the Steelers. However, I think the reason why that's not as much of a concern for me, at least with this Steelers team, is you've got a lot of veterans, and the guys who are not veterans were on this team last year where maybe they had a little too much preseason success, where maybe everybody was a little too loose going into that regular season opener because it looked so easy for them. They hit on big plays. They moved the ball well. They felt like they were cooking in the preseason, and then they weren't quite ready for maybe reality smacking them in the mouth week 1 at Acrisure Stadium. So I think it's it doesn't hurt necessarily to at least score one time with the first team offense and get 6, but Russell Wilson's seen it all pretty much. Justin Fields has seen a lot, and the second and third year guys on this team, they kind of know that preseason success is certainly not an indicator of what it's going to look like when the games really matter. So I'm still going to approach preseason game 3 in Detroit as not that big of a deal, at least holistically. But there are certain things that I want to see from the quarterback play and the offensive line play specifically, because they've been just 2 big question marks to this point.
Absolutely.
And we can talk more about that on Friday's show.
Exactly. We will keep you up to date with what we see more at these practices leading up to the final preseason game against the Detroit Lions. The first one on the road, too. That'll be interesting to see. But stay tuned with all of our work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette by reading our work at post-gazette.com. Find us here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as Tuesday for Brian Batko's Chip Hammond Football, where this past week he interviewed Trey Essex, former Steelers offensive lineman and Super Bowl champion. So we'll get to more here on the North Shore Drive podcast on Friday, getting you ready for that game. Thanks again to Brian, and thank you all for tuning into the North Shore Drive podcast. We'll see you here Friday for the final episode leading up to the Steelers' last preseason game. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.